I apologize that I didn't have time to prepare a nice PowerPoint presentation, so I have a text that I need to keep referring to, so I'll be sitting here reading this, but I really want to use also this opportunity for some interactions, to get some questions at the end that on issues you would like me to further elaborate. So it's very good to be able to participate in this event, and the theme of this Congress, Environment, Society, Imaginaries, the Americas in Motion. It's interesting, challenging. So it's a privilege to be able to be here with you and share some thoughts about the interlinkages between biodiversity, cultural diversity, and development, and to engage you in the way forward and help you engage on a research agenda that is relevant for the kind of agenda that we are developing in the intergovernmental arena. It is very appropriate to have these issues being dealt with by researchers, as there's still a lot of challenges ahead, and the solutions for issues I'll be raising requires interdisciplinarity, and that's not an easy thing to do, and we need occasions like this Congress to promote it. Before referring to the intergovernmental negotiations, I would like to refer to some issues looking at the Americas. So, as you know, the Americas was the last continent to be colonized by humans. Most people think between 25,000 to 12,000 years ago. Several people think even earlier than that. That's still an ongoing controversy. But the fact is that this is the youngest continent to where humans have been interacting to. And at the same time that humans, immigrants, colonized the Americas, we had a big event of extinction of the megafauna in the Americas. So most of the big animals, similar to those that exist nowadays in Africa, for example, we had mastodons, we had other big animals all over the Americas, and they went extinct more or less during this period. And some people believe that extinction was caused by the early human hunters that colonized the Americas, but there's no proof for that. And most probably it was due to change in the vegetation associated with climate change in those days. In the 18th century, many European scientists thought that the biodiversity in the Americas was impoverished as compared to the old world because of the lack of these big animals. But in fact, we know now that the biodiversity in the Americas is much richer than that of the old world. Perhaps more than half of all the biodiversity in the world exists in the Americas, especially, of course, in the tropical part of the continent. As these immigrants, early immigrants, and of course there were many different waves of immigrations, as they adapted to the environments in the Americas, they developed very complex and sophisticated knowledge systems about the biodiversity that they encountered here. So there's a rich traditional knowledge associated with biodiversity in all the human societies that evolved here in the Americas. Of course, about 5 centuries ago, the Europeans got here, right? And if we forgive the very brief visit of the Vikings 1,000 years ago. So the Europeans came here, and of course a lot of changes happened. They started to enslave the local indigenous peoples. They brought slaves from Africa. They brought a lot of plants and animals from the Old World. Much of the domesticated plants and animals that we see nowadays in the Americas came from the Old World. And of course, that also caused a lot of environmental impact. So both the introduction of these species and the competition that they started with the local fauna and flora, but especially the changes in land use, so associated with these introductions. Of course, also the Europeans brought diseases, and that led to mass mortality of the indigenous populations in the Americas. Some people think about 90% decrease in population because of diseases that the local peoples here did not have the resistance to these diseases, like smallpox and others. So many places in the Americas became depopulated. And then, starting in the 18th century, 19th century, many scientists, as they started to research the natural ecosystems in the Americas, they thought these were wilderness areas, never touched by people. Of course, this is a wrong perception, right? These areas were just depopulated because of the introduction of diseases and the wars and all these things. And that's where our national parks started. So, for example, parks created in Wyoming and in California and many other places were based in those what was perceived as wilderness areas never touched by humans, which of course is a mistake. Currently, the Americas is, of course, a melting point of different languages and peoples and cultures. And of course, a lot of different kinds of interactions between these peoples, a lot of mixing also of these cultures and populations. And of course, all this comes to the issue of identity. And there's still a number of issues on identity of human societies in the Americas. Of course, in the late 18th century and early 19th, we had the independence of most of the countries in the Americas, and but for many years, of course, a large number of these countries were under authoritarian regimes. And it was also another phenomena is the explosion of urban population, especially in most Latin America from the Second World War onwards. So nowadays, the Americas is perhaps the most urbanized continent in the world. So there, in the last half a century or more, many rural areas have been again depopulated because of migration of people to the cities. And it's only these last decades when democracy started again to take over most of the governments in the countries in Latin America, that we have been seeing a flourishment of civil society organizations and movements. And that's the time when environmental issues really started to come strong in the agenda of our societies and governments. And in 1972, we had the first UN big conference on environment in Stockholm, the UN conference on human environment. And after that, the next year, UNEP was created, the United Nations Environment Program. And then in most of our countries in the Americas, national environment agencies were created. So it's relatively a short period of time in the last decades where more institutionalized governance for the environment has been created in the Americas. And we're still learning how to do it. One of the issues, of course, is what do we understand by nature here in the Americas? So, of course, nature has been altered by humans since humans arrived here in the Americas. And of course, since the Europeans arrived, the rate of change of our natural ecosystem have changed even faster. One might look at the issue that both nature and pollution are both ecological and social concepts. It all depends about, to a large extent, also how we define things and our perceptions. I like to give examples to my students at the University of Brasilia, for example. If I bring a bucket of dirty here to this room and start spilling dirty around, most of you will think this is not okay, that the dirty doesn't belong to this environment here. But if I take that bucket of dirty and throw it in a nearby forest or grassland, you will all think, well, that's part of the system, so I'm not polluting. So by bringing dirt here, I would be polluting this environment. But by bringing dirt in a natural ecosystem, I'm not polluting. So it's just to raise that these are concepts, so it makes it more difficult for us to analyze exactly our impact on nature. And of course, our perception, to what extent humans are part of nature or are outside nature. Natural ecosystems, or ecosystems in general, are dynamic systems. I can give you an example, the issue of fire. So many people think that fire are just a threat to ecosystems, and certainly fire is one very common kind of disturbance to ecosystems. But I like those researchers that separate the concepts of disturbance and perturbation. For this line of thought, all impacts we produce in nature produce a disturbance to nature. But only those disturbances that go beyond the natural range of dynamics of disturbance in a system can be considered a perturbation. So again, coming to the example of fire, if we have a fire more intense or more frequent than it usually happen in nature in the past, then that's a perturbation. Also, if we decide by public policy to remove fire from nature, even if fire was part of that kind of ecosystem, then that is a perturbation as well. But many people don't see that as a perturbation. But it is, because you introduce a lot of change in the environment by removing one of the sources of the dynamics of those ecosystems. So another issue I want to raise is about the links between biodiversity and knowledge, and especially the traditional knowledge of indigenous and local communities. So as we strive to promote conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, our perception of nature and how we can manage it benefits a lot from those traditional knowledge. And we have to understand at the same time that not only we're facing a crisis of loss of biodiversity and increased rate of extinction of species, and some scientists like to say that we have already started the sixth event of mass extinction. And remember, the last big one was 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs went extinct. So just to show you the intensity and the gravity of the situation, many scientists, ecologists think we have already started the sixth event of mass extinction. We just don't see it because we're not there in the nature, in the woods, all the time. So there are species disappearing all the time at increased rates, right? But even as important, we're seeing extinction of cultures, extinction of languages. So UNESCO has in their website and they update every year a list of threatened languages, and so threatened cultures. In my country, in Brazil, we are unfortunately at one of the countries at the top of the list. So we have in Brazil, fortunately, still almost 200 different indigenous languages being spoken. But several of those languages are spoken by less than 100 people, and some of them even by less than 10 people. So these are languages that, unless something happens, they will go extinct. And together with the language, all the culture associated with those societies. And of course, you know, we haven't been able to document all those traditional knowledge yet. Some of these indigenous cultures in the Americas have been well studied, but most of them have not. So the big question is, how do we face this problem of loss of biodiversity? And to a large extent, it is a problem of governance. In 1968, there was a paper published that labeled an interesting concept, which is the tragedy of the commons. And the idea is that those natural resources that belong to everyone, or where the ownership for specific subsets of society is not clear, tend to be managed badly in an unsustainable way. And we can see that in fisheries, we can see that in the management of forests, because there's no incentive for conservation, because people tend to think, oh, if I stop fishing here, what prevents another one to come and fish in the same area, right? So what is the incentive for someone reducing its fishing effort, right? And you all know that in the coastal zone here nearby, we have witnessed in 91 the collapse of the cod fisheries, right? And since then, both the Canadian and US government has spent millions of dollars trying to restore that fishery, and so far they have failed. So we have to be humble and not think that we can fix anything. Because some people think, okay, we can do anything, and then there's technology, and we will solve all the problems. We have to be more humble and use more the precautionary principle and try not to impose unnecessary harm, so that because these impacts might not be reversible. There's a nice book published just over a year ago by the Harvard University Press called The Mortal Sea, by a historian from the University of New Hampshire called Bolster. He documents the history of fisheries in the Northwest Atlantic, from Massachusetts to Newfoundland, in the last 1,000 years. The last 1,000 years. So that's quite a work to be able to summarize all that history. And the interesting thing is that what he documents is that collapse of the cod fisheries in 91 was just the last one of dozens of earlier collapse in the fisheries of different species of fish, or even the same species. So there has been a recurrent pattern of collapse after collapse. And the answer after each of these collapses has been the introduction of new technologies to increase our fishing capacity, and that only meant more overfishing. It didn't lead to sustainable fishing. All those introduction of new technologies, new boats, new fishing gear, etc., the result was just increase in overcatch and just making the problem worse. So how do we deal with this tragedy of the commons? Many scientists believe that the answer is to find appropriate good governance system. So for example, for local fisheries in many countries, what we see now is partnerships between governments and local fishermen communities, where they give exclusive rights to these local fishermen communities to fish and manage that fisheries, and to benefit in the future for whatever good management they do, and forever restoring of the stocks that they manage to produce. And what we're seeing in those places that have established these systems is that the fish stocks are rebounding. They're coming back, and they can come back quite quickly. In several places, in only 5 years, the stocks are back. Not always, as is the case of the cod here in Northwest Atlantic. I went to Chile last year to visit some of these. Chile has created more than 700 of these local exclusive rights to local fishermen communities. In Namibia, they have created a program called Conservancy, and they have already more than 70 of these concessions for local community to manage wildlife. But they have to report back and demonstrate that they are making sure to introduce sustainability in their decisions on the management of these natural resources. So, the Convention on Biological Diversity was established in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. It's one of the 3 Rio conventions, and the idea was to consider all the issues associated with biodiversity, not only from a conservation point of view, from an ecological point of view, but also from a social and an economic point of view. Because the idea is that the problems of loss of biodiversity happen associated with policies and practices in all other sectors. So the causes of biodiversity are linked to how we practice our agriculture, our forestry, our fisheries, how we develop the policies in the energy sector, in the health sector, etc. So unless we try to address the issue of management in all these other sectors, there's no solution for the loss of biodiversity. And that's why now we are discussing in New York a new paradigm for development. So you know that in 2012 we had the big Rio +20 conference to discuss how to promote a more sustainable development. And many people came out of that meeting unhappy because they thought that the outcome of the Rio +20 conference, the future we want, was not sufficient, that the agreement there was maybe too vague and not strong enough to really change things. But it is the result of that conference that led the United Nations General Assembly to create several different processes that are taking place in New York to negotiate a new development strategy for the world, which should be adopted next year. And as part of that, governments are negotiating a new set of sustainable development goals. Currently, we have the Millennium Development Goals that were established in the year 2000. The Millennium Development Goals are more looking more to social problems, to hunger, to poverty, to diseases. There's not a single goal on economic sustainability, and there's one goal, Goal 7, on environment. But this goal on environment is not linked to the other goals, other issues. So the way the Millennium Development Goals are being implemented is they are implemented in silos. So there's no interdisciplinarity, no attempt to try to see. So if we're trying to, what we're trying to raise in the discussions now in New York on Sustainable Development Goals is that if we want really to promote food security, health, access to water, fight against poverty, enhance human well-being, well, we need biodiversity. Biodiversity is a key component. We just take it for granted, but we're losing biodiversity because of our inconsistency in our policies and practice. So if we really want to be serious about reaching these goals, we need to make sure that we establish the link. So what we're discussing now in New York, there, governments have agreed to discuss 19 big themes, and these that I mentioned are part of them, but also biodiversity and ecosystem is one of these themes, oceans is another one. And the countries are really taking it serious to look at the interlinkages between these issues. So as they discuss these issues like food security, access to water, etc., they are taking into account that yes, we need nature, we need biodiversity. For example, we are starting to face more and more the impacts of climate change. And one of the things that is happening is that the world overall is getting warmer, right? The nights are less cool. And here in Canada, what you see already is that animals and plants are migrating to the north very fast, very fast. And Environment Canada, for example, is already implementing policies to help the trees migrate in the same as fast as the animals and the herbs are moving, because trees move very slow. So what's happening is that they're not being able to catch up with this fast movement towards the north, and this will eventually disrupt the ecosystems. So it's a little artificial, but they're trying to help and plant these trees further north to help them. And this is happening everywhere. In the American tropics, it's not an issue of latitude, but altitude. So animals and plants are moving up in the Andes, right? And the problem is what's going to happen with those that are already on the top of the mountain. They don't have anywhere to go. So probably they will go extinct, right? Unless we can do something about it. So we need to start preparing ourselves for climate change scenarios. And the scenarios, the modeling shows that the impacts will be huge, right? We're seeing sea level rise. We're seeing impacts, for example, in agriculture. So we're seeing new outbreaks of pests and diseases. In British Columbia, we had for the past 2 years a huge outbreak of bark beetles. These are tiny beetles that attack the barks of conifers. And they're killing the trees. But they're not invaders. They were there before. What happened? Winter, the cold used to kill them. Now, except this last winter, there was was somewhat cold, I confess, but some of the past winters have been rather mild and not enough to kill these beetles. So when spring comes, they start already with a very large population. So then they destroy all the trees. So you have huge areas of forest being completely destroyed, right? So this is just a small illustration of the kind of changes we're going to see in the next decades. And if we want to adapt ourselves to these new changes, we need biodiversity. For example, in agriculture. The current agriculture systems will not survive. We will have to change. And part of the answer will be genetic resources. So we will need more and more access to genetic resources to create new cultivars of crop plants, new breeds of domesticated animals, so they will be able to survive the new conditions associated with future climate change. The ecosystem service. So we need water, we need clean air, we need pollination, we need biocontrol organisms to keep under check the pests and diseases. So all of that will be disturbed. And again, the solution will be biodiversity. In Brazil, scientists have done a lot of modeling about potential impacts of climate change in our agriculture. And the conclusion is that it will change everything. Potentially only sugarcane among the major crops will not be affected because it's very heat resistant. But all the other crops will be completely changed. And so this agriculture will be shifting, going elsewhere. So this will affect populations, this will affect nature because they'll potentially be competing with natural ecosystems for new places to plant and breed animals. The conclusion of that study, the coordinator of that study, he likes to summarize saying, well, Brazilians need to get accustomed that in the near future we will be drinking coffee produced in Argentina, because it will not be possible in a few decades to keep producing coffee in Brazil. So that's a shock for Brazilians. And we're always competing with Argentinians. So saying that we'll have to drink Argentinian coffee, that's terrible news for any Brazilian. So people really see the message. So what we're trying to do in the discussion in New York is not only talking about the problem that we have about loss of biodiversity, but talk about biodiversity as solutions, that more and more we really need to understand that biodiversity is part of the solution for the future. So this is what we have been trying under the convention. So to finalize my presentation, I want just to call your attention to the recent developments under the convention. So in 2010, in Nagoya, Japan, we adopted the new strategic plan for biodiversity for this decade, from 2011 to 2020. And it incorporates a broad perspective of the issue, because we failed in the past to be more effective, and we concluded that we were being ineffective because we were working just with the environment community. We were not engaging the other sectors. We were not taking into account the underlying causes of biodiversity, which are all in the social and in the economic environment arena. And we were not highlighting enough the benefits of biodiversity and how dependent all our societies are of biodiversity. Of course, nowadays most people live in cities, so we're more distant from nature, so it's more difficult for us to realize how dependent we are on nature, because we just go to the supermarket and we find all the food we need there. But of course, that comes from somewhere, right? And so biodiversity is essential, even though we don't perceive it on our daily lives. So the current strategic plan has 5 goals. The goal A is addressing the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by mainstreaming biodiversity across government and society. And the idea is to really incorporate more the issues of environment and biodiversity, especially within public policies, private corporate policies, policy related to not only development, but poverty eradication, etc. Goal B is to reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity. So we're talking about deforestation, overfishing, we're talking about pollution, we're talking about invasive species, things like that. Goal C is to improve conservation efforts. So we're talking about protected areas, we're talking about threatened species, we're talking about erosion of genetic diversity, so how to reverse all that. Goal D is to enhance the benefits of biodiversity to all societies. So we're talking about the issue of ecosystem service, we're talking about the issues of how to internalize this strategic plan at the national level, so that each country incorporates in their own legal framework, in their own governance systems, necessary mechanisms to really change the policies towards more sustainability. And finally, goal E is to enhance implementation to through a more participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building, and resource mobilization, funding. So this is what we're trying to achieve, and of course, alone we're not going to achieve these. I'm not going to mention to you the 20 global targets for biodiversity that were agreed to be reached by 2020. I would like to invite you to take some of your time and access our documents and read in our webpage. You will find very easily these 20 Aichi biodiversity targets and have some idea of what we're trying to achieve there. But each of these main goals have several targets, specific targets. We are going to organize our next big conference in South Korea this October, and there we will be making a first major review of progress made or lack of towards reaching these Aichi targets. And so we will be issuing a big global report. We call it the GBO. This is the Global Biodiversity Outlook Report, number 4, that will be launched in South Korea in October. And also a major report on resource mobilization. How big is the challenge? How big is the gap between available funding and the needs to fulfill these needs? So to finalize, the message I like to bring is that societies can be more or less sustainable. There are many descriptions in history of human societies that have collapsed. So it's not only cod stocks that can collapse. Human societies can collapse. There's a nice book called Collapse by Neil Diamond, a geographer. Jerry Diamond from University of California. And he documents how many past human societies collapsed because they destroyed the natural resources they were based on. And of course, this can happen again. Nothing prevents us from that. At the same time, we do have many societies that have proven more sustainable. So these are issues we need to discuss more in our societies and make sure that we have more participation of everyone on this. So for example, earlier this year, there were huge floods in England, for example. So many areas were flooded, many houses destroyed, etc. And then if you read the newspapers, the declarations of politicians, etc., they're not going to do anything. They think that wasn't a big issue, and they're not going to try to change anything. They're not going to. So public policies affect, for example, where people build their houses. So we have a number of initiatives under the UN to reduce losses associated with natural disasters, right? And of course, in the past, the main aim has been just to coordinate more the relief action to help people being struck by disasters like tsunami, hurricanes, etc., or big floods or big droughts. This shifted to a more interesting program in the last decade to look at how we can prevent these disasters. So the floods, droughts, tsunami, earthquakes will continue, but we can dissociate them from human suffering. But that needs more prevention. So how can we prevent these things? Well, first we need to protect more nature, because part of the capacity to prevent and resist to these more intensive natural phenomena is to have robust natural ecosystems. So mangroves, for example, coral reefs help to protect against the impact of tsunami. Wetlands, well preserved, help to absorb the excess water in big floods. But if you destroy all that, then there's going to be a lot of suffering, and many deaths. The other part of the equation is to convince people not to build in vulnerable places. But we still see public policies. For example, I don't know how it is here in Canada, but in the US, they still provide insurance to anyone willing to build in areas where floods are very common. So why should they do that? And people still build houses in places vulnerable to tornadoes in the US. And if you go to Oklahoma, you will discover that most homes have no underground part for them to protect themselves against a tornado. They're just not preparing themselves for this. So that's a recipe for disaster. So that's what the UN is trying to move now towards more prevention. Well, then that's why the agenda on biodiversity and the agenda that we promote under the CBD is relevant, right? Because we're trying to promote more conservation, more restoration, and more sustainability in the use of natural ecosystems, but also human-made ecosystems like agroecosystems. So it's just to finalize, it's up to our societies whether or not we will collapse in the future or whether we'll be wise enough to develop a more sustainable path for ourselves. And certainly those societies that still prefer short-term choices with preference for short-term economic gains at the cost of nature, they will have to pay a higher price in the near future in terms of more intensive vulnerability to natural disasters, for example, and more vulnerability to climate change. So that's the price. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diaz. We have at least 10 minutes for questions. There's no microphones in the room, so you just suggest that you stand up and try to speak loudly so that everybody can hear the questions. Sir, if you want to start.
Ricardo Green from York University. Thank you so much for this talk. It's really important. Issues are fundamental. We're facing huge challenges, and we're not facing them, in my opinion. The challenges are so many levels, because we're creating levels of governance and regulation, both nationally and internationally, that actually work against every one of the goals that you exposed, right? Any real effort to confront the questions of climate change and biodiversity loss would face challenges in both finance and trade and investment. Every one of the rules works against that, because the whole idea of globalizing movement of money and goods with no consideration to local conditions and the extinction of species and the emissions that involve, any effort to restrict that directly goes against these rules. And we are laying more and more of those rules. The round of negotiations of the WTO never went anywhere. And now the United States and Europe and so on are pursuing their agendas through bilateral and sub-regional agreements that are actually creating more barriers. And if I'm not well involved in the discussions around the SDGs, but of course you're right in the way you foresee them and the way they should come about. But is that where the stream is going? Is that really the direction this is moving? Because the pressures from the power centers of power is all about bringing more market mechanisms, bringing more the private sector, and we know what the private sector is doing on these matters, and avoiding any kind of restrictions to the expansion of capital. So we may end up with SDGs that have nothing to do with what you talked about. And you're right, we're facing situations of collapse. The problem is that there's tremendous money to be made in poverty. We know that a long time ago. But there's tremendous money to be made in ecological destruction. If you think about Canada, it's embarrassing, right? But we are. It's not true to say that Canada is not adapting to climate change. Actually, we're adapting enormously. I had a graduate student doing work on exploration of oil in the Arctic. And when I read the paper, I was in shock. And I want to tell you that we are opening the north. As the ice clears, we are going into an enormous new resource grab.
That's true. The Arctic is a very fragile ecosystem, and it's being opened now, and it will be opening very fast for development and potentially a lot of impacts. That's for sure.
Sorry.
No. Well, you're right. There's no guarantee. So my students always blame me to be too optimistic. I think we have to be optimistic because otherwise we are defeated from the start. So I think we have to believe that we can change things, and yes, we can. It is. It is. No, but we have to increase the involvement of all stakeholders, because if you leave policies to be decided by just a few people, that will be decided by corporations, right? And will certainly not meet the interest of most of society, right? So how do we do that? Information is key, right? Education is key, right? So we have to make better use of these tools and others. It's a big challenge, but it can be done. In my country, in Brazil, for example, Brazil is not different from others, so there has been a lot of unsustainability in our development in the past, and there still is. But in 2005, the government decided to really fight against deforestation in the Amazon. So the Minister of Environment, Marina Silva at that time, when the government, the Labour Party government of President Lula took power in 2003, she decided that that problem was too big for the Ministry of Environment. So she went to the President and said, the Presidency needs to embrace this issue. And the President's office did do so. So they started to coordinate all the ministries, and they mobilized more than 20 different policies from different ministries to work on this. And we managed to reduce by 80% the rate of deforestation in the Amazon since then. So it's possible. But just the Environment Ministry could not do that. Livestock management is the largest land user in a country like Brazil. And for the most part, they have been very unsustainable, right? But since 2009, things start changing there. What happened was a convergence of pressure. So the Brazilian government finally in 2009, just before the climate change meeting in Copenhagen, decided to adopt national targets for reduction of greenhouse gases. And that was a result from pressure from the environment sector, but also from business. So many business sector understood, especially those sectors which have a more long-term planning. They understood that unless they deal with this issue, they would be impacted by it. So the government adopted these targets, and they adopted targets for each production sector, including livestock, saying, okay, you will have to reduce your emissions of greenhouse gas by 2020 by this amount. And another process is that civil society also has been putting pressure on unsustainable livestock in Brazil also for some time. So there has been a growing program that started from civil society called Carne Legal, the legal meat. So it's a movement from civil society in Brazil against the big meat companies that are promoting deforestation in the Amazon. Then another big initiative, Greenpeace started throwing rocks, and they're very good at some corporations, in the grain sector in Brazil. So all the main grain sectors, because they were buying soya grown in areas recently deforested in the Amazon. So they managed to get all these big grain companies, and the Minister of Environment helped in that, to sign a voluntary commitment on a moratorium not to buy soya from the Brazilian Amazon. And they are monitoring this, and this is being enforced. It's a voluntary initiative, and it is working. So there are government policies and voluntary initiatives. One of the government policies, the Minister of Environment monitors regularly deforestation in Brazil and fires. And we make public all that information. Everyone has access to that data. And then some years ago, the Minister of Environment managed to make an agreement with the Brazilian Central Bank. And the Central Bank issued a resolution saying that those municipalities that were champions of deforestation and that were included in the blacklist by the Minister of Environment would be cut off from public funding. And they were. You can imagine the next day they started knocking the door of the Ministry of Environment asking for help. How do I get out of this blacklist, right? So we need to use both sticks and carrots as always, right? But we need a good mix of those, and it works. It works. So yes, it can be done, but it doesn't mean it will happen, right? It doesn't mean so because much of the business sector and much of the government is still just looking at short term. So sustainability issues really are not really considered.
All right, thank you. There's a few questions. You were first. First. Please go ahead, sir.
First, thank you for your intervention. And well, my question is about governance. And some analysts are saying that the problem to face the states are kind of multi-level governance and the multiplication of factors at all levels, and finally, complexity of decision making and complexity of implementation of these public policies. So, for you and for your institution, what is the ideal world? What would be the best governance to resolve this state?
Well, there's no magic bullet, right? Countries are different. They're federated countries, like here in Canada, in Brazil, US, elsewhere. In a country like Brazil, my experience is that it's good to have a balance between different governance levels. If you, in a country like Brazil, if you go too far in the decentralization trend, it's a risk. Because, for example, in the Amazon, many of the mayors of municipalities in the Amazon, they are owners of lumber companies. And you can imagine what kind of decision they will make. So it's the central government, the federal government in Brazil, that is the one more distant from pressures from local economic interests that really can impose more the environmental policies for the benefit of the overall society. But of course, central governments alone cannot do everything. So I think we need a good balance of these different governments. Of course, a convention like the CBD, as all the other conventions, these are conventions, intergovernmental conventions. So they are conventions among national governments, federal governments, not the states, not the cities. And of course, that's a problem. There are some studies for the US showing that more than half of all the money spent on biodiversity is spent at state level. So the federal government is not even the second, it's the third source of funding. So we need to pay more attention to these different levels of governance. Under the CBD, we established since 2007 an initiative to engage the cities. So we have adopted a formal initiatives on cities and biodiversity. Last year, in our the year before, in 2012, in our last conference in India, we issued a first global report on cities and biodiversity. And we're trying to raise why biodiversity is important for local governments. Of course, all cities need access to water. All cities have problems of waste management. But increasingly cities, and especially big cities, like the city of São Paulo, for example, in Brazil, with 20 million people, are facing huge problems of floods every summer. And these are increasing with global warming. So how do we face that problem? Well, having more green space in the cities is part of the solution, because you need more areas capable of absorbing the excess water. If you pave everything, if you build everything with concrete, that will not absorb the water, the excess water. So the floods will be worse. So we need to take those issues more into consideration. There's more recent research, for example, showing that human well-being and human health are benefited by having more green areas, showing that neighborhoods where you create more green areas, there is a tendency to reduce levels of violence. Hospitals that provide access to nature for their patients, the recovery is faster and better. And this is scientific studies showing this. So there's a lot of reason why we should pay more attention to biodiversity at the local level. But I went to the last global forum on a global urban forum in Medellin in Colombia a month ago, and you hardly could hear anyone talking about the environment. So we're still a long way from that.
I was going to ask about the new paradigm that you were talking about. What is the position about mining? That is one of the topics that we are talking in this conference, and that worry us. So, and the other question about this paradigm is that how do you work with, involve you other epistemologies when you write these documents and when you have these meetings?
Yes. So yes, we need different to take into account different kinds of knowledge and different knowledge systems, and that's a challenge, and all this interdisciplinarity is always a challenge. Yes, mining is a big issue, is one of the sources of impact on biodiversity. At the same time, we are all dependent on minerals and metals, right? So we cannot just decide, okay, let's stop mining overnight. And of course, unfortunately, we depend on fossil fuel. And of course, we need to rapidly reduce our dependence on fossil fuel and promote more renewable sources. And I should not comment on internal politics here from Canada. But these are big challenges. There are some ways forward. So, for example, in Rio, 4 years ago, there was a big meeting of the industry on petrol and gas. And one of the issues they discussed there was how to operate in vulnerable ecosystem. So they took the Amazon as the focus of the attention, but the same would apply to the Arctic or other vulnerable places. And it's amazing to see how they were able to agree on voluntary standards for the petrol and gas industry to operate in vulnerable ecosystems. So there's a big initiative in the petrol and gas sector to discuss environment issues now for a number of years. It's called IPEACA. And they have partnership with IUCN, with other big NGOs and the universities to promote new ways to do mining with less impact to the environment. In the Amazon, for example, the first big project to exploit gas in the Brazilian Amazon was established based on this new, some of these new principles for low impact operations in vulnerable ecosystems. So what they did not open roads. They established the plant all by helicopters. They brought everything by helicopter to the middle of the forest and established the plant. And then after a lot of negotiations with everyone, they managed to agree on a route for a gasoduct to send the gas to the cities. So if you compare this to the more traditional way we operate, which is to open up roads, start building all these facilities, and then there's a lot of immigration with no control and a lot of indirect impacts because of lack of good governance. So it worked. Apparently you can do some of this mining with much less impact. There's also a lot of discussion about offsetting. So if some loss of biodiversity is unavoidable, if you cannot mitigate at all, or if you try to mitigate and there's still some remaining impacts, there has been quite a good scientific and technical discussion about what should be adequate rules of the game to promote offsetting. So that would apply to the mining industry, for example. So what would be acceptable in terms of offsetting? We should certainly ask for more than what is lost in the same quality or even more. And certainly not all ecosystems are redundant. So not all ecosystems can be substituted. So there are irreplaceable areas in the world. And so for these areas, we should not certainly utilize offsetting. There's a big meeting coming now on this. There's a big initiative called the No Net Loss Initiative. There's going to be a big meeting in London early June to discuss this further. There's a big network called the BBOP, the Business and Biodiversity Offsetting Program, where they have been discussing from a scientific point of view the rules of the game. What rules should be utilized if we want to consider offsetting? Because especially for developing countries, you cannot expect that developing countries would agree not to halt all their development, all the building of their infrastructure, etc. Just because here in the first world you have all these infrastructure in place, you cannot expect that developing countries would agree not to do some deforestation, to build some new facilities, some new roads, ports, whatever. And of course, these will have environmental impacts. So the question is, we should not expect an agreement from all these countries on zero conversion of ecosystems. That would not be reasonable. But if that's not reasonable, then what? What is the next best option for us to pursue in terms of public policies to operate so that we can reduce the environmental impacts of mining and other initiatives?
Well, thank you very much. I will close the keynote.
So,